Hello, my name is Ryan Sullivan, and I'm a detective with the Red Wing Police Department and the Juvenile Liaison Officer for the Goodhue County Education District. Today we're going to talk about the intensive supervised release of a Level 3 predatory offender into our community. Ordinarily, when a release like this occurs, we schedule a public meeting to provide this same information. At the end of the meeting, we try our best to answer any questions that may remain. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, we will have to provide this information to you virtually. We appreciate your flexibility. Before I begin, I want to stress that it is extremely important for all citizens of Red Wing to be educated and informed on this matter. If questions remain at the end of the presentation, please send an email to Detective Tom Rickley, whose email can be seen on the screen. We will do our best to provide any clarification where we can. The Red Wing Police Department is just one of several agencies with a role in monitoring and supervising the predatory offenders who reside within our community. With regards to the specific role of the local police, we have no involvement or control over which offenders are released, where they're released, or when they're released. That task is the responsibility of the Minnesota Department of Corrections. The job of the Red Wing Police Department is to ensure that all predatory offenders who reside within our community are up to date and compliant with their registration. With predatory offender registration, offenders are required to provide the local police department with several things, including a current address, phone numbers, any vehicle information, and places of employment. The Red Wing Police Department also conducts routine and random predatory offender registration checks to ensure that the predatory offenders who reside within our community are in compliance with their registration requirements. As mentioned before, the Red Wing Police Department is just one of the agencies tasked with supervising and ensuring compliance of these predatory offenders. At this time, I'm going to turn it over to Brad Vandervecht from the Minnesota Department of Corrections, so he can, in greater detail, explain the role the Minnesota Department of Corrections has with regards to supervising predatory offenders in the state of Minnesota. Thank you.
Well, hello and thank you for taking the time to review this important information. And as you heard, my name is Brad Vandervecht, and I'm with the Minnesota Department of Corrections in the Risk Assessment and Community Notification Unit. And I'm here today to assist Red Wing Police Department in its efforts to get you some important information with regard to the individual registrant you're here to learn about today. And the way I'd like to do that is really in three distinct parts. My presentation is going to come at you where I'm going to really set out the foundational information of our state's overall risk management system and how it applies to this unique population. And then I'm going to get into the specific information about the man you're here to learn about today. And then I'm going to go on to some resources for you as you contemplate how you're going to use this information in both your family and broader community safety planning efforts. And so where I like to begin with information like this is kind of where we as a community and as a society already have some underlying or foundational information and knowledge. And that is that this population, this group of individuals, they exist. Unfortunately, in our world, sex offenses occur and they are as varied and as unique as crime itself. But what we really want to know as a community is what is it we're doing as a state, as counties, as cities, and communities in addressing those who we become aware of once they've come through that risk management system. And so one of the first components or pillars of that system is the registry. Now, the state's registry came online in 1991, and it is really founded out of the advocacy and effort and work from the Jacob Wetterling family and on to the Jacob Wetterling Resource Center. And upon the abduction of Jacob, they came together and asked law enforcement, what more can we do to assist you in the important work you're doing, to be as proactive as possible with regard to this population of individuals? And law enforcement said resoundingly, what we need is a way to collate our data and systems. Up until the registry, what would happen inevitably is as individuals were identified as sex offenders within certain jurisdictional regions, that information would be housed or siloed within that department and would only be shared should something occur in another community or district. The registry collates all that information so that law enforcement across the state and even beyond now can access critical information when it is most advantageous so that they can get involved as quickly as possible to intervene when and if it's necessary. So the registry is set by law in 1991 and registers a number of different individuals we'll get into here momentarily, but it's maintained and managed by the state's Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, or the BCA. And the registry is structured as such by law to maintain all this information, to include, as you heard earlier, the address of the registrant, be that their primary address, and any secondary addresses, places they may frequent often. Think places like vacation properties or family members' homes. If they're there with any level of frequency, they must register that also as a secondary address. They must register their employment, and that's all employment. And if they operate a motor vehicle for that employer, they must also register that information as well. Other things they must register is any schools they're attending or enrolled in, or any kind of vehicles that they themselves either use, own, or possess. So even the old junker in the backyard must be known to law enforcement. Additional components of the registry include things like their phone numbers and other things that they may rent, like storage units or storage lockers. And so you can see the robustness of the data collected and maintained by our state's registry that's available to law enforcement should the need arise. Now, the state law also deems that this information that's collected and maintained is private data. And as such, it is for law enforcement purposes only. Now, the next thing I want to talk to you about, and often comes up in meetings like this, is, well, then who, Brad, has to register? And in Minnesota, the registry has kind of grown and morphed. Back in the early 90s, it focused on sex offending conduct and behavior only. However, as the registry went on, the state saw the benefit and value of it and expanded it to non-sex related crimes such as kidnapping and false imprisonment. And this is why some of you may recall the name change. It changed from the Sex Offender Registry to the Predatory Offender Registry. And an easy way to keep it straight in your mind as we go forward today is to know that anybody charged or convicted of a sex offense is a predatory offender. But not all predatory offenders are sex offenders, as you're going forward, just as a way to kind of keep it straight. So as I mentioned, the Predatory Offender Registry is predominantly for law enforcement purposes only. However, for meetings like this, I'm able to take kind of a 30,000-foot flyover view and share with you some of this information so that you can start to really get your head around the entirety of this conversation. And what I'd like to do first is to really put in your mind an analogy of a funnel and think at the broadest end as being those incidences that occur in our society. And what we know from our data and statistics and research, and we know an awful lot, is that of those incidences and offenses that occur time after time, only a portion of those will go on to be reported to law enforcement, and our funnel narrows. Of those that get reported, only a portion of those will go on to be formally charged, and then we narrow further. And of those formally charged, only a portion of that group will go on to receive convictions and sentences. And then of those sentenced, only a portion of that group will go on to cross the threshold of a state prison. And that's a unique distinction we'll get into more detail on here coming up. So as you're thinking about this entire conversation, I want that awareness broad. I want you thinking about all individuals that enter your communities and interact throughout our neighborhoods, because they are all worthy of our scrutiny. So some of this information I want to share with you is, as of the first of the year, the state of Minnesota had approximately 18,798 registered predatory offenders within the state. And you can see from that number, you've already narrowed it to those that have been convicted and charged and therefore placed on the registry. Now, as of the 17th, so just a few days back, I took a snapshot within the communities around Red Wing. And a couple things I want to talk about here is, one, these numbers are very dynamic in nature. These individuals do tend to move with some frequency. But for a snapshot, it gives you some context. And you can see in Goodhue County, as of the 17th, there were 101 registered individuals residing within the county. Now, that is individuals with no risk level assigned because they have not gone to prison, or those designated levels 1, 2, or 3. And the smaller number to the right of my slide, you'll see Goodhue County has 3 registrants who are subject to that broad public notification. So 3 out of the 101. You can look at Red Wing proper as well. On the same date, the 17th, there were 58 registrants residing within Red Wing who are subject to that registry. Again, no level assigned or levels 1 through 3. 3 of whom are those designated level 3 individuals. And you can go on and look at other neighboring communities as I go down the list. Just know the number to the left are all registered predatory offenders in the community. The smaller number to the right are those deemed designated for broad public notification. You'll notice Wabasha County, for example, has 0 registrants that are designated for broad public notification. And remember, what that would mean is that somebody residing within that county may go on to the Department of Corrections public registrant search and try to look up Wabasha, and they would not find it, meaning there are none who are subject to broad public notification. But you can see that there are 48 registered individuals within that county. So having that broad awareness is just so very important as we go forward. Another component of that broader state risk management system that I really want to share with you today is, it came online in 1997 and is the Community Notification Act. And this is really founded out of research and understanding that a well-informed community is in fact a safer community. And it is the very reason we're able to sit here today and share this important information with you. And so because it's the core of why we're here, it's worth going into some additional detail about how this law works. So as you recall from my earlier slide, the Notification Act does not apply to all registered predatory offenders. For it to apply, the individual registrant must have crossed the threshold of prison, not county jail, but state prison. Now that could be any state prison in the Union to include U.S. territories, federal prisons to include military prisons, or those individuals who have been civilly committed for sex offending conduct or behavior. So inevitably, those that it does not apply to are those registered individuals who were convicted as juveniles and those who have received stayed or probationary sentences as a result of their court process. Those are your no level assigned individuals. So as you're looking at the Community Notification Act, another question that will often come up is, well, then who does what? How does this system function? And so the Department of Corrections is tasked with the responsibility of assessing and assigning risk levels to those registrants that cross the threshold, as we just discussed. And the way that that is done is through the state's End of Confinement Review Committee, or the ECRC. And this committee comes together, convenes 90 days prior to the registered individual's initial release into the community. And it takes into account all of their known information. They do an exhaustive document review of all history that's known and collateral contacts included. And they run this interview and this process through an assessment tool known as the MinSOST, or the Minnesota Sex Offender Screening Tool. Now this is a validated screening tool that's gone through all the rigors of the scientific process that was born out of a research study conducted here in our state by our Department of Corrections. The study began in the early 90s and ran all the way through the early 2000s, so well over a decade. And it followed initially a group of 3,166 known sex offenders upon release into the community throughout that time frame. And it marked their successes and it marked their failures. And this is the fundamental research study that created those or identified those known predictive risk factors. And so as I go forward in my presentation today, know that as I refer to risk levels 1, 2, and 3, I'm speaking specifically to those known predictive risk factors from that group of their peers from that study. Now, a follow-up study was completed in 2012 as well, and so we have a robust research data set, well over 5,000 known sex offenders over that length of time. And so once this risk assessment tool is applied, a risk level is determined and ultimately assigned. After it's assigned, the handoff then goes to law enforcement. Now, law enforcement is tasked with the duty of providing notification to communities within the scope of that risk level. So for those designated risk level 1, that lower amount of known predictive risk factors, law enforcement will notify other law enforcement agencies. They may notify or shall notify victims of and witnesses to the offense should they request that level of enhanced notification. And they may also notify immediate adult household members residing in the home with that registrant. And that is the scope of a level 1 notification. Now, with level 2 notification, the notification expands beyond those individuals and entities we just discussed to also include individuals and entities designated by law enforcement to be at particular risk based on the registrant's known pattern of offending behavior and conduct. Now, often what people will think when they hear that is, well, that means schools and daycares. And while that very well may be true, it's not always the case. For example, if law enforcement were to get notified of a level 2 registrant that's coming into the community, and upon reviewing the dossier of information they received from the risk assessment notification unit, they determine that this individual focuses their pattern of offending behavior on adult females at social gatherings. Think places like bars or concert venues or something along that nature. They may determine at this point that it does not enhance public safety to go and notify local daycares of this individual, given that their primary clientele are children from birth to school age. Now, on the flip side of that is if you think of a level 2 that's coming into the community and law enforcement, through their review of the packet provided to them, determines that this particular level 2 focuses their pattern of conduct and behavior on those unaccompanied teens. Think minors and teens in transit from school to after-school activities or home, that downtime between school and home. And law enforcement knows in their community there's a local hotspot where teens like to congregate and hang out and socialize. In that scenario, law enforcement may very well go to the proprietor of that teen hotspot and give them specific notification, something along the lines of, hey, this individual, if you see them here loitering about, formulating relationships, talking with the kids, let us know. We'd like to come out and talk with them and find out a little bit more about what they may be up to. And so that's the nuance of a level 2 notification. And then on into level 3, those with the higher amount of those known predictive risk factors as compared to their peers. Law enforcement will go on to provide broad public notification. And we in the Department of Corrections commend and thank the Red Wing Police Department in all its efforts to ensure that this very important information gets out to the broadest amount of people as possible. And know that notification comes in all manners and shapes and forms. Every agency is going to inform its community in the means and the mediums that it's most familiar with. And so there is no hard, fast rule on how notification works or looks. So at the narrowest end of that funnel analogy, as we're going forward, I want to share with you the amount of risk levels assigned. Now, year after year, those registrants crossing the threshold of our state prisons does fluctuate and change. However, the risk levels assigned tends to stay very static. On average, year after year, we see that the majority of risk levels assessed and assigned are that of level 1 or level 2. 15% on average are assessed and assigned that risk level 3, and that's your narrowest end of that funnel. These are the folks we are able to share with you publicly. But the information we've gained and learned from all of them across the board is so very valuable for you to utilize and implement into those family safety plans. So I want to share with you some data from that research tool that we use in our state. First, just a quick snapshot, again, on the 17th, in case you're kind of wondering just how many of those subject to broad public notification are in communities today. As of the 17th, there were 453 level 3 or those subject to broad public notification, meaning those civilly committed, in and around Minnesota communities. And we know that they do not solely exist where their head hits the pillow at night. In fact, where they spend their sleeping hours is where their risk is at its lowest. We want to be broadly aware of where they spend those waking hours. And we know that they travel in and around communities day in and day out, much like we do. They're entering all manner of communities and neighborhoods for all the same reasons we do, to visit family, for recreation purposes, shopping and things like that, or treatment and counseling and so on, work and others. So having that broad awareness, again, just so very critical. So with the data, there's a couple pieces I really want to make sure you're aware of today that I think is going to help you hopefully augment those family and community safety plans further. The first thing I want to share with you is what we know about the relationships between those who engage in this kind of harm and the people they hurt. And what we know from our research and other research studies, in fact, this one here that I'm sharing with you today is from the Department of Justice. And I like to use this one just to show you some cross-comparison analysis and to show that our numbers really do align with other national figures. But as you can see from this data, the majority of those who are harmed by this kind of conduct and behavior are known to the person that's hurting them. They are either direct family members or acquaintances. And those people who engage in this kind of harm use that relationship and that trust to exploit it for their ends and their means. Now you'll see 7% of this falls into that stranger category. And that as a community is what usually gives us the most pause, as it should. Because when we think about it from a family perspective and a community perspective, we have a lot of control over those who are within our family, specifically, having contact and relationships, and those who we are allowing to become acquaintances with the people we care for most. Where we have the least amount of control, at least not directly, is on those stranger groups. So it's worth really kind of pulling this apart a little bit to look a little further. And one thing that's worth knowing as you're contemplating that 7% is the way this study was conducted. These studies had to create a cutoff. And the researchers determined that 24 hours of a knowing or a relationship would be that line. And so inevitably, with that kind of a cutoff, those incidences that may occur, think of a scenario like two teens meeting at a house party who had not previously known one another, and the night was going the way it was going, and they left together of their own free will and accord. However, once they got outside of the group, the night took an awful turn. That scenario would fall into that stranger category. But what we tend to think of more when we think about stranger is we think about that person that's lurking just beyond our consciousness, just outside of our awareness, who has ill intent. And that group falls in a much smaller percentage, right around 3%. Now that is cold comfort, I'm well aware. But as you're contemplating those safety plans and how you're going to implement this in your own family and communities, know that where your energy is best spent is where we know the most likely incidences may occur. And that is very much with those relationship-based offenses. Other information I want to share with you to apply into those safety planning efforts is the age breakdowns of those who are harmed by this kind of conduct and behavior. Now, if you're like me, you're going to look at this slide and you're going to see it's broken into thirds. But pretty quickly, you're going to realize that 2/3 of that group are children. And then you're going to look even further and you're going to see the narrowest age range on this chart is 13 to 17. And that group constitutes 33% of those who are harmed by this conduct and behavior. And that's staggering because that's 9% of our population's total. And it's worth unpacking what's really going on here. Well, here's what we know as communities and as families, is that from birth to about 12, we know that those trusted adults, those family members, those trusted community members are very much in the picture when dealing with those children. They are vetting those people that get to come in and have those important relationships with those kids. And so as state agencies and as city agencies, we want to make sure that those trusted adults have some of the best tools available to them so that they can vet those people well. But what ultimately ends up happening when we get into those teenage years is the very thing we work so hard as a community to create. A safe environment where our children can grow and thrive, and they deserve every bit of that. So that when they get to those teenage years, they can start to go out and develop and exercise their autonomy. But ultimately, this is the thing that lends to that vulnerability. Because now our teens are creating relationships just beyond or outside the watchful eyes of their trusted adults. And so what had been the old model of the talk, where parents or loved ones would take their teen aside at that critical time in their life and sit them down and pull back the veil just enough to show them that the world may not be or is not as safe as it had been made to be for them when they were younger. Now, with that model, we find that teens often will throw it kind of back in our parents' faces and rebuke what they're saying and say, no, Mom and Dad, you're overreacting. The world's a very safe place. I'll be fine. So what we find is far more effective is to have a bunch of little talks all the way up and through into those early adult years, from very young ages up, each age appropriate in their approach, focusing on just enough data and information to keep them well informed so that by the time they get to those critical teenage years, they have a robust toolbox and skills that they can rely on when their direct support network isn't available to them. Now, the one thing we know from our research and study and in our collaboration with victim services groups very much is that the information we share with our children, we must be careful as parents and loved ones, because the one thing we know is that frightened children, scaring them or dumping this information on them does not create safer children. Scared kids are just scared kids. But we also need our kids to understand on the flip side that a nice person does not always equal a safe person. And so I will provide you some additional resources here in a little bit for you as you're contemplating applying this information to those family safety plans. So now I'd like to take and shift gears with you and go over the details and information about the man you're here to learn about today. Use this information I provided you thus far as an overlay and see where things may align to what we know and see if and where it may diverge. This is Theodore Leeson. First, I want to speak to photographs. Photographs are updated on average every 12 months annually, or should the individual significantly change their appearance. So if you were to see Mr. Leeson out into the community and he has cut his hair, shaved his head, or otherwise changed or modified his appearance in such that you feel he does not look the same as these photos, I want to encourage you to reach out to either the corrections agents that are going to be working with him or law enforcement or both, to inform them of that, and they will go out and they will attain new updated photos. And those will get posted with the Predatory Offender Registry, and then I will attain them and make sure they go on the web so that you will always have an accurate photographic depiction of this individual for as long as he is subject to broad public notification. These are Mr. Leeson's vitals. He's currently 34 years of age, and he will be residing at the 700 block of Plum Street here in Red Wing. Now, often a question that comes up in meetings like this is about address. And people will ask me, Brad, can we please know where he lives? It would give us a great deal of comfort if we knew what house he was residing in. And you'll remember back to my earlier information and that though that information and data collected by the registry is private information and therefore cannot be made public. However, we accomplish a lot with a proximal address. Chiefly, those who live in that community and area will be very aware of Mr. Leeson as he comes and goes through the community. And they will share that information among themselves, and that's just fine. But what we don't want as state agencies and law enforcement agencies is to put out that kind of specific information and have those who have no stake in your community and all the hard work you've put into creating a safe environment coming in and exacting some revenge scenario that does nothing to mitigate or minimize risk and only serves to disrupt all that you've worked to achieve. And that is the purpose for those proximal addresses. This is Mr. Leeson's registrable offense history. This is not an exhaustive criminal history. This is what's placed him on the registry and ultimately led to his risk level assessment. And so we're focusing on that because it's the reason we're here to talk today. If you're interested in a full criminal history, you can certainly attain that on the BCA's website through their criminal history search. But I want to really get into the details of what happened because you've already been provided this paragraph in the fact sheets that law enforcement has made available. So this is the registrable offense. In 2008, Mr. Leeson was convicted of criminal sexual conduct in the 3rd degree in Wabasha County for a 2007 offense. His offense was against 3 separate victims, each teenaged, ages ranging from 13 to 15. He was 21 years of age at the time. And he used his relationship or relationships of knowing of others within their social circles to get to know them and create comfort among them. So he was meeting them through acquaintances that they each shared. And he was able to use attention and affection as a way to create these separate relationships with these 3 teens. If you were to ask them at the time, they'd tell you they were dating. And he used those to exploit them in recurring incidences. So this happened over a period of time. And he used that affection and attention, but he also then went into gift giving and providing mood-altering substances like alcohol and things like that. So he was very much creating those relationships through those means and doing it in a way, in an effort to try to maintain that control. Ultimately, though, after he was found out for his crimes, he was brought to justice through the court system, and he was sentenced to a 60-month commit to prison. Now, I want to take this opportunity to speak a little bit about another question that often comes up in meetings like this. And that question is Brad, why is it that people that engage in this kind of harmful conduct that really just tears at the fabric of our communities and shocks the conscience, why are they allowed to come out? And that answer lies in part in determinate sentencing. Now, prior to determinate sentencing, the state had used a model of parole back in the early 80s and prior. And with a parole model, as you might well imagine, for those who had engaged in publicly heinous types of crimes or incidences, they found it exceedingly difficult to be granted parole by the parole board and would often, as a result, end up serving their entire sentence in the prison institution. Now, typically upon hearing that, the community's reaction is a bunch of head nods and a sentiment strongly of, that's just okay by us, Brad. They can serve their full sentence. But what we learned from our research and study on recidivism rates was that that model was not effective in bringing recidivism down to where we could best manage it. And so we implemented, actually some time back now, it's been in play for a while, the determinate sentencing model. And the way that model works is this. The courts impose a sentence based on the severity of the crime and the criminal history of the individual that committed the crime. And that generates a presumptive term of imprisonment. In this case, for this individual, 60 months. Then that term is broken up into thirds. 2/3 by law if they cross the threshold, meaning if the court does not stay that sentence and place them on probation. 2/3 of that sentence will be served in the prison institution by law, and 1/3 will be served in the community, also by law. They will come out. That is the way the law is structured. Now you'll see after that I have 10 years of conditional release. That's a unique enhancement or modifier because the court system is also one of those components of the state's broader risk management system. And so what 10 years conditional release means is that final third, no matter what size it is, depending on the amount of months that they've been sentenced to, is extended for 10 years. So that this individual and others like him who get convicted of similar offenses have that additional time to work with correctional staff and agents in the community where they are to apply those skills and tools that they've learned while in the institution through treatment, counseling, and other programming available in the community safely and effectively. And if at any time they were to fail to meet those expectations, even on a technical term, they may be revoked back into the institution to serve more of that time to adjust whatever their programming may require. And so this is in part the answer of how and why they come out, because ultimately their sentence will expire. And when it expires, we want to ensure that we have instilled enough of those mitigating factors through treatment and good application of it in the community to effectively impact risk for a lifetime. We want those internal mechanisms to be there to aid this individual or anyone who comes through crosses our system, to be able to be instilled in them so they can remain successful for a lifetime. So this is Mr. Leeson's prison chronology as it sits. He came into prison in March of 2008 upon conviction for the criminal sexual conduct. And in July of 2008, he had been assessed and assigned a risk level of 2 and released on that final third, along with the 10-year conditional, back into the community, just as we had discussed. Now, at that point, that notification would have been, as we talked about earlier, specific to those individuals or entities whom he may have been in direct potential risk for. But as you can see here, Mr. Leeson was brought back into the institution because his term of supervised release was revoked in March of this year. He came back for technical violations, meaning he did not commit a new sex offense. There was no new criminal conduct or behavior. However, he was engaging in behavior that was not conducive to reducing risk. And so he was determined to be needed back in the institution to adjust his treatment and so on, so that he could be better set up for success once he gets re-released. Now, anytime a registered individual returns to prison for any reason, if they cross that threshold again, they are reassessed by the End of Confinement Review Committee. And that committee will look at all those things that were occurring in that violation report and determine if broader notification serves a greater purpose within the community. And that is exactly what happened here. The ECRC determined that with Mr. Leeson, that it was of greater benefit and public safety to engage the community as the next part of that broader risk management system. So they assessed and assigned him as a risk level 3 in April of this year. And he will be re-released into the community now as a level 3 on the 24th, and will be residing here in Red Wing under intensive supervised release. So as far as Mr. Leeson's requirements to both the Department of Corrections and the Predatory Offender Registry, this is his breakdown. He will remain under correctional supervision through December 30th of 2021. He'll be working directly with corrections staff, but at that point his sentence expires. He will be subject to the registry, however, until August 16th of 2030. And so long as he remains law-abiding, that will be his expiration date from the registry. And at that point, he will come off notification, he will come off the registry, and he will have all of his rights restored. So I want to take this moment to talk a little bit more in detail about supervision and how supervision works, because he will be under supervision with the Department of Corrections for a year. The ISR protocol or program came online actually before the registry back in 1990. And the way this program is structured is really unique to Minnesota and is actually quite effective in reducing risk of those determined to be at that higher risk and higher need category. And the way it does this is by implementing reduced caseload size and intensive treatment and programming with a lot of agent follow-up to provide that structure into the community as they transition out, with the goal of successful reentry at its core. Again, remembering that we want to instill those risk mitigating components into these individuals so that when the corrections entity is no longer applicable, they continue on in a safe, healthy way. The release planning process, it begins when they're in the institution with a caseworker who functions as essentially like a probation officer in the prison system, working with them on getting them into whatever treatment they need, whether it be sex offender programming specifically, anger management, chemical dependency programming, counseling, therapy, and so on. And then they begin to work with them on that transition out. And when it gets close to that 90-day mark, they start to engage the agents in the community to ensure the best release plan possible. so that they can increase those protective factors, those known protective factors and risk mitigating factors, and reduce those risk factors. And so often a question will come up, well, Brad, how did it get determined that this place, this living situation was the best? Brad, it's very close to places where children are known to congregate. It's very close to parks, playgrounds, schools, daycares, dance studios, et cetera, et cetera. And here's what I'll share with you, is that while certain locations may not be as ideal as others, we have to work within the scope of what we have available. And that also includes what the registrant has available. And at the end of the day, sometimes a not great choice is better than a really bad choice. And for those who need this level of intervention and support in the community, it's known that homelessness is our worst case scenario. And so this is how ultimately this massive equation of where and how can they reside. And then once they come off supervision, those restrictions and requirements are off, and they are free to live as any of us do. And they will enter communities for all the same reasons you and I will. For family support, or being near loved ones, to be near work or resources, transportation, and things like that. All the same reasons we ourselves enter into communities. And so ISR has a number of different tools to assist them in that goal of successful reentry. They do utilize GPS monitoring when applicable and appropriate. They can take them off and put them back on, and know that ISR is a tiered program. And so as they progress through the program and show that they are incorporating those or instilling those conduct and behaviors that we want to see, they start to receive more and more of their abilities to be out in the community for recreation time with approved family outings and things of that nature. Know that ISR operates 24/7, 365, much like law enforcement. It is a highly structured program. They are very much involved. I had mentioned earlier that the caseloads are structured and set by law. On average, as a regular supervision agent of sex offenders, enhanced sex offender supervision, you're looking at a caseload as an individual agent in around 50 to 60 registrants, which is actually very manageable for that agent. With ISR, no more than 15 registrants can be assigned to any one agent. And so you see just how focused they are on their caseload. And believe me, one agent to 15, you get to know your people very, very well. And also engaging the community. It takes all of us. No one entity can do this on its own. Not law enforcement, for as good and capable and professional as they are and have been for years in dealing with this population, they don't do it alone. Same said with the Department of Corrections. For as good and competent and great as they can be in helping change lives, they can't do it alone, and neither can the community. But all of us working together, communicating with each other, sharing our information, and making sure we know what's going on, then we can be most effective in reducing that risk. This is the supervision team that's going to be working with Mr. Thiessen. You can see the size of the team and their supervisor if you need any kind of contact names. This is their best contact number. It goes to their voicemail that's monitored 24/7. It won't be answered directly, but leave a voicemail if you have any questions about supervision, rules, procedures, or anything else that may come up as you're trying to get your head around this important topic. Use them as a resource. Other resources, and probably the best resource for you, is your local law enforcement. If you see this man or anyone, as your broadness has been expanded and your awareness has been opened up, if you see anyone engaging in conduct that you believe to be questionable, that raises the hair on the back of your neck, whether it's this man or anyone, I want you reaching out to law enforcement, because as you know, they have more of an in-depth knowledge of those people in and around the community than you or I may. And so by calling and saying, I'm not sure if this is a big deal or not, but I saw this going on, you help them greatly in ensuring compliance of all registrants and anyone who enters the Red Wing community. If you have questions about patrolling, certainly call their non-emergency number, just questions about how this department works with this unique population. But again, if you feel like there's a threat or an imminent threat to safety or a concern, call 911. Other resources, as we spoke about earlier, with having those age-appropriate conversations all the way up and through into the adult years, I want to steer you towards one of the best, I think, touchstone resources available, and that is our Jacob Wetterling Resource Center here in Minnesota. They're a fantastic starting point. A lot of times in meetings like this, questions will come to me, Brad, how do I have this kind of conversation with my child who may be developmentally delayed or have some sort of unique requirement that is atypical, and this is a great resource for you. I want you to reach out to them, and if they can't help you directly, they can most certainly get you connected with the right resources. Also know that the JWRC is available to come out and speak to community groups, family groups. They even speak at schools. They can have workshops for children, parents, all across the board. Fantastic resource. I also want you to be aware of your local victim services provider. Inevitably, with conversations like this, the reality of what we know, and that offenses like this occur as they do, the odds of someone viewing this having been impacted in some way, either directly or having supported somebody who's been impacted by this kind of conduct and behavior, is pretty likely. And conversations like this, despite how hard we work on making sure that they don't trigger folks, inevitably can and do. If you find that you've been triggered by this difficult conversation, or you know someone who may be or is struggling themselves, especially in times like this where our anxiety is already at a high point, know who your victim services provider is and reach out to them and utilize them if you need them, or make sure that anyone you know or may be caring for or supporting, if they need them, knows who to call. I want to make sure you have this information readily available to you. As I conclude my presentation today, and thank you for bearing with me, I know it gets to be a lot of information. We try to cram as much as possible into as brief of a period of time as we can. But if you take nothing else away with what I shared with you today, please let it be this: that what we know from our research and study, and we know an awful lot, is that 90% of those who come through that full array of the state's risk management system do not go on to reoffend in a same or similar fashion. Once they've come through those thresholds of that prison, their recidivism risk drops down to about 5%, 3% while they're on supervision. 90% of those who engage in this kind of conduct and harm are known to the people they hurt. They use that relationship to exploit that friendship or that comfort with the people they hurt. Which ultimately means our awareness needs to be focused on those that we do not know about yet. 90% of those engaging in this kind of harm actively in our communities today are not known to the system as sex offenders. They have not been previously convicted, and that's why that broad awareness is just so critical. Folks, it really does come down to relationships. That social proximity is so much more telling than any geographical proximity or residence could ever be. Where their head hits the pillow at night is where their risk is at its lowest. It's where they spend their waking hours, and they can be spending that time in a lot of different places, where I want our awareness at its highest. Geographic proximity is not a predictive risk factor. These folks will travel to exploit a relationship that they've created. And that's where the bang for our buck really comes into play. Here's another slide just with some additional resources to keep you going. Don't let this be the only information you receive on this important topic. This is just the tip of the iceberg, but I want you to have it available. As you go on to get more information, be sure you're sharing it amongst your community, neighbors, and friends. But be cautious too. Make sure you're vetting the resources that you're looking at. Make sure they're coming from a reputable, trusted source of information. If you're wondering if it's a reputable statistic or data, certainly reach out to those individuals or entities I've already described, be it myself, probation, law enforcement, or victim services. And they will certainly help get you in the right direction for good information. Lastly, for state-specific resources, again, and this is more for those individuals that are looking to vet people coming into their lives or people's lives that they love and care for. The state's Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, while it maintains the POR, and that is for law enforcement purposes only, also has that criminal history search function. All you need is an individual's first name, last name, and date of birth, and you can see any convictions they have in the state. And I would argue that anyone who you're considering to have that kind of access, be it a coach or a tutor or a babysitter or whatever the case may be, if they're unwilling to provide you with their first, last, and date of birth, I would argue that they probably do not belong on your short list for consideration. Other information I want to make sure you have readily available to you is on the Department of Corrections website. All of the research and data I've been throwing at you today is available there in its raw form for you to review and draw your own conclusions. If you're like me and naturally skeptical of a guy sitting on a camera telling you all these pie charts and slides, by all means, go on to our website and check that information out for yourself. If you cannot find it, please call me. My information will be available at the end of this presentation, and let me know, and I will help you get there. The DOC also maintains an offender locator. This is for any individual that has been convicted and sentenced to the Department of Corrections and is under their active jurisdiction. If you know of a felony, be it a sex offense or any other felony offense, and the individual's gone into prison for it and you're curious as to what's going on with them, this is your research tool. And then also the offender locator, or the public registrant search. That is for those individuals we mentioned earlier, the 440 some those subject to broad public notification are available on that public registrant search function for you to look at today. If you want to, you can go on there, you can search by name specifically, by city, by zip code, or by county. And you can see, or you can leave all the search fields blank and say, show them all to me. And this is also a great tool. Often a question will come up as to when this individual leaves, will we be notified? And the answer is kind of twofold. One, law enforcement shall notify a community if a public registrant or somebody subject to public notification leaves a community, if law enforcement can confirm that they will not come back. And obviously that's a very difficult thing to confirm because no doubt whatever brought this person here is resources that will still probably remain after they've moved on. And so they therefore may very well be returning and re-entering the community from time to time. And so law enforcement is very cautious to sound an all clear. So what's more likely is that you'll just go onto that public registrant search tool and see that he's no longer registered in Red Wing. And you can look him up by name and see where he's gone to. If he's come off the registry entirely, it could be either because he's expired from the registry, or his risk level has been reduced, or he's moved out of the state. And so those are the different ways that that could occur. Now, typically in a meeting like this is where we would open it up to public conversation and really try to be there to answer your questions and provide you with further specific information that you may be requiring as you're thinking about those safety plans. Now, obviously, given the restrictions of COVID and wanting to make sure people are safe and healthy, that's not available to us. But I really want to encourage you to reach out with your questions. I've given you hopefully some really good, valuable resources, whether it's the agents specifically, if you have questions about supervision, law enforcement, if you have questions about policing, victim services, if you have questions about family safety planning and how to talk to your children, or myself, if you have any questions about the entirety of the state's risk management system or just need some guidance on who your best resources are, certainly be reaching out. I want to thank you again for taking the time to sit through this, and I want to thank the Red Wing Police Department for inviting me out here today to speak with you.